Bueno, muy buenos días a todos, muchas gracias por su asistencia. Les recuerdo, estamos entonces en este ciclo de conferencias por parte de la Cátedra México-China, Eugenio Anguiano Rojo, y que es un esfuerzo conjunto entre Agenda Asia y el Centro de Estudios China-México de la Facultad de Economía de la UNAM. La doctora Shirk, la presentamos ya el lunes, va a dictar entonces hoy una segunda conferencia, el próximo viernes una tercera y última conferencia. Me gustaría simplemente y sin volver a presentar a la doctora Shirk, agradecer mucho a los dos comentaristas que tenemos. De nuevo, la intención de los comentarios es tener unos comentarios de alrededor de unos 10 minutos, algo así, con la intención simplemente de lograr, en fin, empezar una discusión sobre temas, y explícitamente la intención también es lograr más tiempo para preguntas y un intercambio con ustedes, que el lunes fue un poco más breve por cuestiones de una larga introducción, inauguración. Yo les recuerdo, tendremos a dos comentaristas. Les agradezco a ambos de nuevo. Está por un lado el doctor Carlos Heredia Subieta, doctor en Economía por parte de la UNAM, profesor catedrático investigador del CIDE y quien ha venido trabajando sobre temas comerciales del TLCAN, el TPP recientemente, vinculado con investigaciones al ITAM también en los últimos años, ¿no? Muchas gracias, Carlos. Y en segundo lugar quisiera agradecerle también al doctor José Luis León-Manriquez, profesor investigador en la UAM, quien ha venido trabajando desde hace algún tiempo, por no decir varias décadas, pero sobre temas de Asia-Pacífico, China. Hemos sido coautores de un reciente largo documento con la RIAL, y ha sido profesor e investigador también invitado en la Flaxo en Costa Rica, y con experiencias fuera de México significativas, y que de nuevo ha publicado con Adrián Hearn un grupo de documentos y libros, un reciente libro sobre esta relación de América Latina y China. Sin mayor introducción, entonces pasamos al inglés. Dr. Shirk, thank you very much again, and the floor is yours.
Well, good morning. It's a pleasure and a great honor to have this lectureship here at the Mexico-China Center at UNAM. I've really appreciated the opportunity to get to know and learn from the community of people interested in China here in Mexico City, and it's been a wonderful opportunity for me. I hope it will be the first of many visits here. And I also want to mention, before I get started, that I'm a research professor and the chair of the 21st Century China Center at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego, where we teach master's students and PhD students. We have a very strong interest in Mexico as well as in China. And we're very eager to have more students from Mexico. We have a new public policy program that started this year, as well as a master's in international affairs. And we also have a new China master's program for students with pretty good Chinese to do original research, a thesis on China, because we have such a strong faculty on China. So I want to especially for the students in the audience and for the faculty, please spread the word that, and there's fellowship money available for Mexican students, so there are fellowship opportunities. So please look into it, go online, and check us out. Okay, well, on Monday, I spoke about domestic politics in China, about, especially within the Chinese Communist Party, the dynamics of leadership politics in particular. And then today, I'm really trying to make the bridge to foreign policy. I'm talking about Chinese domestic politics and foreign policy, and then on Friday, I'll talk about U.S. policy. How does the United States try to encourage China's constructive role in the world, and how does it respond to the rise of China? Now, of course, domestic politics affects foreign policy in all countries. And this was really brought home to me, of course, when I served in government as part of the Clinton administration, State Department from '97 to 2000. I learned a lot about domestic politics and China policy on the US side, but also I saw very vividly how Chinese domestic politics that I'd been studying for a long time impacted its policies toward the United States and to other countries in the world as well. And so when I came back from Washington, I wrote a book called China Fragile Superpower. And as I wrote this book, I floated the title China Fragile Superpower to my Chinese friends as well as my American friends. And when I told Americans the title China Fragile Superpower, they understood superpower, but they really didn't understand fragile at all. But when I told my Chinese friends that I was writing a book called China Fragile Superpower, they questioned whether China was really a superpower, but not one Chinese friend questioned the premise that China was internally fragile. So I think that's quite telling. So I would argue that the most important fact in understanding China is that China's leaders are actually very politically insecure and nervous about how long the Chinese Communist Party can actually rule China and what that means to them. You know, behind the headlines that we see about China, the emerging superpower, and how powerful it is a country with a political leadership that is constantly worried that the Chinese Communist Party could be reaching the end of its reign. Now, of course, this fear became particularly, I'd say the fear is structural, built into being a Communist Party leader with very poor information about what people actually think about you. But the fear became particularly acute after 1989, when the People's Republic almost collapsed. You had mass demonstrations in more than 130 cities for several months. The leadership split on how to respond to the protests, how to handle them, and the government survived only because the People's Liberation Army obeyed orders to use force to put down the demonstrations. So the party leadership took away from that experience three very important lessons. Prevent large-scale protests. Avoid public leadership splits that could embolden mass opposition, and keep the military loyal. And then, of course, following the Tiananmen crisis, you had the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and communist governments in Eastern Europe and Russia started to collapse. So that really had a tremendous impact on the thinking of China's leaders. Xi Jinping in particular has really been quite publicly talking about the lessons of the fall of the Soviet Union, and he is following a how-to book based on his interpretation of the lessons of the fall, the violent, sudden fall of the Soviet Union, which of course fell top down, not bottom up. It fell because of splits in the leadership, and from his point of view, it also fell because neither the military nor the party itself, the party members, were sufficiently loyal to defend the regime in its moment of crisis. So, and you know, China's leaders look out from Zhongnan High and they see a society that's been so dramatically transformed since the days of Mao. Market economy, open to the world, millions of Chinese go abroad, millions of foreigners live in China. People move around. It's not like the Mao days where you were born because of hukou determined where you lived out your life because of these residential controls. So from their standpoint, this is a society teeming with unrest. I don't see it that way. I don't think that's true. But you can imagine if you're a communist leader, if you're Xi Jinping, it looks pretty scary. How can the Communist Party maintain power over such a dynamic, open market economy? And as I mentioned on Monday, we have no precedence for this. There's no precedence at all. So what they are particularly worried about if they're thinking about social unrest is anti-foreign nationalist protests, because they are very aware of the lessons of history. Nationalism, anti-foreign nationalism, could provide the glue that knits together different discontented social groups. You know, urban people are upset about, middle class are upset about one thing, rural people are upset about another thing, students are upset about a different thing. But what could meld them all together is a criticism of the government for being too soft, too weak in the face of outside foreign pressure or aggression. And in Chinese modern history, this is the kind of nationalist revolutionary movement that overthrew the Qing dynasty in 1911, the Republic of China, and then overthrew the Republic of China in 1949 by the communists. Anti-foreign nationalism and a criticism of the current government for being too weak in the face of foreign insults, foreign pressure, brought these governments down. So the Chinese Communist Party leaders are afraid that their dynasty could meet the same fate. So there are other reasons that they feel so insecure, but you know, I just want to emphasize that when we're trying to think about whether or not China has the capability, not the capability, whether the Chinese political system can manage a peaceful rise without provoking other countries and in a way that leads to military conflict, the first reality that we have to wrap our minds around is the fact that China's Communist Party leaders are extremely nervous and insecure, and domestic threats to them loom much larger than foreign threats, than international threats. So so foreign policy is basically a means to staying in power domestically. And this helps us understand how they behave internationally. Now, because we have to think about not just China's increasing capabilities, its economic capabilities, its military capabilities, we have to think about its intentions and how it decides how to behave internationally, the choices it makes. Is it a risk-taking power? Is it a revolutionary power trying to tear up the global order and redefine it? Are its aims very limited? Is it cautious? Why don't we focus now mostly on this question of, is it a cautious power or a risk-taking power? So let's talk now about China's behavior and how it's changed over time, its international behavior. And then let's go back and look at features of the Chinese political system that I would flag as causing me to worry that the Chinese political system may not be able to sustain a peaceful rise. So let's talk now about how China has been acting internationally. Up until a few years ago, I'd say up until 2008, 2009, the signs were encouraging that China was on a path to rise peacefully. It did behave as a cautious, responsible power that was concerned primarily with its own domestic problems and intent on avoiding conflicts, international conflicts, that could disrupt economic growth and social stability. So they wanted to keep the economy growing. They didn't want to get into any fights with their neighbors or with the United States. And so they adopted a policy that I would call a reassurance policy, a reassurance strategy, designed to reassure other countries that as China grew more powerful, as it rose in power, it was not a threat to any other country. Its intentions were benign, they're friendly. They don't want to use their power to infringe on the interests of other countries. And this was an approach that was laid down by Deng Xiaoping. And probably the fact that Deng Xiaoping laid down this restrained, reassuring approach in this slogan, which, by the way, of Tao Guang Yang Hui, which is to keep a low profile, helped sustain it because it was associated with Deng Xiaoping, and Deng Xiaoping had such prestige, such personal authority, that when he laid it down, even if people didn't really love it, they followed it. And one of the most, to me, I found this foreign policy strategy so impressive because I thought that it showed a very sophisticated understanding of the value to a country of its reputation, its international reputation. International relations scholars often emphasize, if they're studying reputation at all, they emphasize a reputation for resolve. But actually, a reputation for restraint is equally important. Because if you don't have a reputation for restraint, nobody wants to be your friend. If you're just out for your own interests, your country, your national interests, and you're not attentive to the interests of other countries and willing to accommodate them, then nobody wants to be your friend. And if you look at China today, China is a country largely without friends. It tries to buy friends, and it threatens countries that oppose it by applying different forms of commercial pressure. But if you look at who really is China's friend, North Korea, not really. Russia, totally instrumental, in my opinion. They lost Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos, which is their wedge into ASEAN. But those countries are economically dependent on China. China makes clear that if you say or do anything we don't like, you're going to be sorry. So restraint is very important. And in this period before 2008, 2009, China's policy, its strategy, was one of showing restraint and trying to reassure other countries to build its reputation and prevent a coalition of other countries from balancing against it. It's Avery Goldstein's called it a Bismarckian strategy. And I could go through all the things that China did, but what's important is that it wasn't just its words. You know, I remember, because I've been at this for a long time, I attended the very first meeting on Asia-Pacific security that China held back in about, I think, 1993, 94. Chen Shih-chung was there, and major experts from the military, from the foreign ministry, from think tanks, as well as people from other Asian countries. And it was interesting because I gave a paper on my idea of a concert of powers for the Asia Pacific. And everyone hated it for different reasons. But let's just talk about the Chinese reaction. Of course, Southeast Asians didn't like it because it flagged Russia, China, Japan, the US as the major powers in the region. But all the Chinese, except for one Chinese general who's very smart, all the other Chinese said, oh, we're not a power, we're not a leader, we're a poor developing country, you know, we couldn't be at an equal level with these other powerful countries. This is 93, 94. And they said, if you talk that way, you're just contributing to the China threat theory. And they were talking about how China is not that powerful, in an effort to reassure other countries. But as China's growth was skyrocketing and its military budgets were starting to grow, nobody believed those words. They weren't credible. So what China did very effectively was use its actions, its policies. It settled almost all of its land border disputes with its neighbors peacefully. There's a great book by Taylor Fravel about this. And what's interesting is that China compromised on territory in resolving all of those land border disputes with its neighbors. The only one that was left unresolved was with India. It also offered free trade agreements to its neighbors. It was easy for China to do because especially after 2000 when it joined the World Trade Organization, because it had already reduced its tariffs quite low. And its diplomacy was very effective. So remember, China is surrounded by 20 neighboring countries. If China can manage relations with those countries effectively, it's a great big security blanket. So this is a diplomatic challenge, and they rose to that diplomatic challenge in this period between the mid-90s and 2008. Now, there were some blind spots that are the focal point of domestic nationalism, namely Japan and Taiwan. But I won't talk about those right now. But by and large, China's international behavior up until 2008 gave hope that China's leaders had the motivation and the skill and the interest to guide the country to rise peacefully. I didn't even mention how China was joining all these global institutions and regional institutions. So it was really trying to show it was a responsible power. But after 2008, Chinese leaders seemed to have difficulty in sustaining this restrained approach to the world. And I don't know how much time I have to go through all the examples of this. I guess the most important ways, the most disturbing ways have to do with the maritime disputes in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and also some mistakes in its relations with Korea, North Korea and South Korea. So globally, China became more ambitious. It started to invest on every continent and play a bigger role. But by and large, it really wasn't aggressive or assertive. It was done on a commercial basis, and the other countries mostly seemed to welcome China's presence and to feel that they benefited from it, although the way Chinese investors handle those commercial relationships is not always ideal, and you often do get some political pushback from the public, certainly, in those countries. But the biggest problems are really within Asia of this loss of restraint. And why did it happen around 2008, 2009? Largely because it was the global financial crisis, and this led to which of course was caused by the failures of the American system. So America was blamed for the global financial crisis. Our reputation, our soft power of our system, especially our economic system, took a big hit. And it led to a misperception in China that the United States was on the decline. I say misperception. Maybe today I might agree with that perception. But in 2008, 2009, what I think many people realized is, that the U.S. had taken big hits, economic hits in the past, been challenged by Japan. Everyone at the time, back in the 80s, thought Japan was going to overtake the U.S., but the U.S. came back because of the resilience of our economic system. So, but in China, there was a view that the U.S. was on the decline, China's on the rise, so it created a demand for a more muscular, assertive foreign policy, both at the public level and at the elite level. And certainly, since this is a turning point, an inflection point, and it coincides with the global financial crisis, that's the most parsimonious explanation. I'm going to give some other domestic sources that I think also contributed to this change in international behavior. Because perhaps the most worrisome change in Chinese foreign policy was its assertive approach to enforce its expansive claims over the waters and rocks in the South China Sea, one of the most heavily trafficked maritime transport waters in the world. China's claims are contested by Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Philippines. Taiwan makes the same claims as China does. And like China, Vietnam and the Philippines also had ramped up their maritime activities. That was more drilling for undersea gas and oil, and fishing, because as the stocks of fish got depleted by overfishing in coastal waters, fishermen pushed out further into the South China Sea, into the exclusive economic zones of other countries. So, and what you got is an increasing number of tense clashes between China, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And I have to point out that the South China Sea, as of 2008-2009, was not a focal point of popular nationalism in China. It was hardly discussed in the media. The focal point of nationalism has been Japan and Taiwan, and maybe the United States, but not the South China Sea. What happened instead was that under the Hu Jintao leadership in 2008-2009, you had 9 bureaucratic interest groups that figured out that if they could be seen as assertively defending China's claims in the South China Sea, they could get bigger budgets, more ships, and it would really augment their own bureaucratic power. And so what they did is started engaging in this defense of maritime rights activities, which were coercive and also symbolic. Go plant a Chinese flag on the floor of the South China Sea. Fishing militia, fishermen organized as militia, behind them these non-military but sometimes quite well-armed civilian maritime vessels that at a minimum have these huge water cannons. They also, and when they did these activities, they brought the TV cameras with them and went public. And so what had not been the focal point of popular nationalism became the focal point of popular nationalism, which is where we are today. And of course, by doing this, they are really alarming the same neighbors that they had been working to reassure so effectively up until that time. And as I see it, a lot of that problem, I mean, to me, this is not action that is actually in China's own national security interests. It creates this exactly the kind of counterbalancing coalition that they had sought to avoid, and is kind of dividing the region into two blocks. What happened, of course, is that a lot of these countries, as well as countries in Northeast Asia, who were not directly affected, but were alarmed by what China's behavior was saying about what kind of rising power it is. What are its intentions? Is it intentions to be just to turn the South China Sea, which is mostly, in terms of the law, international waters, to turn it into a Chinese lake? And is it willing to tolerate this high degree of tension with its neighbors in order to achieve this goal? So, Asian countries with those concerns came running to the US, which of course they didn't have to run very far because the Obama administration had undertaken the rebalance or pivot to Asia, and they were much more present than they'd been previously. So the Asian countries said, please, would you like to refuel in our ports? Repair your ships in our ports? Can't we exercise together? They felt they needed protection from this kind of rising China. And to go back to these 9 parochial interest groups, the fishing agency, the oil people, Hainan Island, all of them, not necessarily powerful interest groups. But why were they able to do that? I think it's largely because of the nature of the policy process in China under Hu Jintao. He was a relatively weak leader. He did not have an appetite for power. And his approach to governing was to have a true collective leadership. So the Standing Committee of the Politburo didn't exercise any restraint over these bureaucracies, because in the Politburo and the Standing Committee of the Politburo, each one of those senior Communist Party leaders is responsible for a set of bureaucratic agencies, the Shitong. And so they just went along with what their agencies wanted to do. And the way the collective leadership made decisions did not result in restraint. You might have thought that it would result in restraint, because if you have to have consensus, then you should be moving slowly and be cautious. If the problem should be inertia, not overreaching. But in fact, it didn't work that way. Instead, you got a kind of dynamic of a sort of log rolling, in which each czar of a particular Shitong was allowed to just run his domain however he wanted. And none of the other senior leaders, or Hu Jintao himself, questioned it or said, this is not good for China. So you got this kind of overreaching. And this, by the way, there's a international relations scholar at Columbia, Jack Snyder, who has written about this kind of decision-making in pre-war Germany and Japan. So I think it looks quite similar. So this type of political system was not adequate to maintain a peaceful rise. Another problem with the Chinese political system that aggravated the problem is that either the National Security Advisor, the top foreign policy person, official in China who is housed in the Communist Party, or the foreign minister, neither of them is really a senior enough official with enough power to exercise restraint. They are only Central Committee members. They're not even Politburo members, much less Standing Committee and Politburo. In most countries, the foreign minister is a very senior member of the cabinet with a lot of influence. That's not true in China. And I think that is another big problem. Meanwhile, nationalism was stimulated by the focal point of the maritime disputes in the South China Sea. The media plays to it. I don't have time to talk about the media and the internet now, but the commercial interests of the media reinforce the official propaganda, which also promotes nationalism, and you get, a lot of nationalism is just spontaneous. China's a rising power. It had, a century of humiliation, and it's not surprising that Chinese people feel very proud of what China has achieved. But that isn't the kind of nationalism we're talking about. We're talking about this anti-foreign nationalism. And it is stimulated by the information environment in which you get these nationalist myths that get very strong, that are very strong. Finally, let me move on to talk about Xi Jinping for a minute. So when Xi Jinping came in, I thought, okay, this is going to be better, because my analysis was that the weak leadership of Hu Jintao had led to the loss of restraint in Chinese foreign policy. But it turns out that it doesn't look that way. It looks like we have a very different kind of decision-making process that is much more centralized by a leader who is trying to exercise greater control. But he's not using that control to restrain Chinese foreign policy. To the contrary, he's using it to have a more ambitious and muscular foreign policy. And again, much of this is driven by his own domestic insecurity about maintaining internal security and internal support. For one thing, he is very much concentrated on making sure that the military is behind him 100%. So let's remember, Hu Jintao, I think Xi Jinping felt that Hu Jintao actually never really was commander-in-chief. He never really took charge. He didn't take over the head of the military commission until 2 years late, and then he didn't really take charge of the military very effectively. He had no military connections, and so actually that was part of the problem back from 2008 till Xi Jinping came in 2012, is that there was a lot of poor coordination between the civilian authorities and the military, which also aggravated this assertiveness. But Xi Jinping comes in one of the first things he says is, I want a military that is prepared to fight and win wars. He has recently, and he takes over the head of the military commission from day one. In April of this year, he took on a new title of Commander-in-Chief of the Joint Battle Command Center. He has done a very ambitious restructuring in the military, as well as trying to clean up the corruption in the military. And so, preparing the military to be a fighting force is a major part of his platform. And it has domestic motivation, primarily. Let's hope. He's also, Xi Jinping owns the maritime disputes, personally. Because even before he took over as the #1 guy at the 18th Party Congress in 2012, he had been put in charge of a leading small group managing these maritime territorial disputes. So he was the guy who said, let's combine these civilian maritime agencies into a powerful Coast Guard. But the mission of the Coast Guard, unlike in other countries where it's about safety at sea, is the defense of maritime sovereignty claims. The ships come from the Navy. They're huge, they're big and capable, and they're well armed. Actually, I did a few dialogues with the Coast Guard. Coast Guard is modeling itself on the U.S. Coast Guard. But the U.S. Coast Guard became capable mostly to fight drugs. It is well armed to fight drug organizations. But China is arming its Coast Guard to defend these maritime claims and to push away the Coast Guards, the fishing boats, the other vessels from other claimants in other countries. And by the way, and this is very important for U.S.-China relations, also challenging the right of the U.S. Navy to sail through those waters. And of course, the U.S. Navy, in addition to doing freedom of navigation operations to establish that this is, these are international waters, they also do cruise in the coastal area of China, in what would be China's exclusive economic zone, in order to do military surveillance activities of especially the submarine developments around Hainan Island. And this really galls the Chinese that the U.S. Navy is coming so close to China. Of course, during the Cold War, we had Soviet ships right off the coast of California and other places. And you know, if the public doesn't really pay that much attention to it, it's no big deal. But once you publicize this, it's very hard to explain why the government is allowing this. So what you had happen is you had a lot of challenges to those surveillance vessels from the U.S. Navy, which is very dangerous. Snipping the radars, harassing them in various ways. Highly provocative. Of course, they feel that the U.S. sailing there is highly provocative. So another big problem with Xi Jinping is that he has centralized decision-making to the extent that now these bureaucratic agencies may be more under control or more restrained, but they actually don't even know what's going on because Xi Jinping is calling the shots. And this makes diplomatic communication very difficult. Because if you try to contact the foreign ministry or the foreign affairs office, like the National Security Council office, people don't know actually what's going on. Makes it very difficult for diplomatic communication. So, what we have is a leader who has concentrated power, who's trying to maintain his rule and strengthen his rule by hyping foreign threats, by drawing clear lines between universal values or Western values and Chinese values, and by using these territorial disputes as a kind of focal point of nationalism. Xi Jinping's rule combines a high degree of repression with a high degree of anti-foreign nationalism. So, although the decision-making process is more concentrated and in that respect an improvement over what we had under Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping is not using his concentrated authority to go back to a more restrained approach to its neighbors. Now, let me just end by saying that this worries me. I worry that the Chinese political system, this combination of a kind of broken decision-making foreign policy process, anti-foreign nationalism that is promoted by a very politically insecure Communist Party leadership. And one additional point that I forgot to mention is that the interest groups with this, you might call the peace coalition, or the peace groups that have the strongest interest in a peaceful environment for China's rise, don't really have much voice in the foreign policy process. So, you know, I go to China, I talk to private business people, and these people are actually very concerned about Chinese foreign policy. They see that China has no friends, that is provoking a lot of threat perceptions. This could make a big problem for their efforts to do business in other countries. And yet they really don't have much voice when it comes to the foreign policy process. So they're worried and they're frustrated. The foreign policy process is dominated by party officials, by interest groups related to internal security that actually benefit in terms of their bureaucratic interests from a tense international environment. That's the military, that's the Ministry of State Security, Ministry of Public Security, and they're very powerful, and right now Xi Jinping runs them directly. He is the security czar as well as the #1 leader of China. So the interest groups are skewed in the direction of groups that, in terms of their voice, groups that benefit from a tense international environment. So, just recently, I read a short essay, and I'm going to conclude with this, by a Chinese scholar who is, you know, I've always admired for his objective analysis. And he wrote just a short little piece about what the election of Donald Trump would mean to China. And here's a quote from him. He just wrote it on the 18th of November. China, an evidently weakening and disorganizing U.S. and the West, would inevitably present many strategic and diplomatic opportunities, while a much more protectionist world would also substantially increase China's economic and financial difficulties at a time when China has its own economic and financial troubles. Here's the key sentence. Besides, as Chinese strategic prudence has significantly reduced in recent years, a weakening and less organized West may very likely make China even bolder in strategic foreign policy long term. And the next paragraph describes that as a risk. Not a good thing, a risk. I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Susan. So we'll start with the two discussants, and we will start with Carlos Heredia, please.
Bueno, muchas gracias al doctor Dussel por la invitación y un gran gusto participar en las actividades del CHINA-MÉXICO y compartir la mesa con la doctora Sherky y con el doctor José Luis León y tener aquí la presencia de Eugenio Anguiano, que es hombre de quien se ha establecido la cátedra. I guess I'll pick up on where you left at the very end of your presentation on quoting this Chinese scholar saying that a weakening United States poses opportunities and challenges to China, and that a bolder China may be a risk. Did I understand that? To China, yes. Yes, to China itself. Exactly. And when you mentioned your book, The Fragile Superpower, the one word that I've heard more often associated is reluctant. Reluctant superpower, at least in the Mexican academia, in the sense that China is reluctant to appear as a superpower, to engage in what diplomats say, I want to be part of power sharing, but not of burden sharing. In that sense, that's how I mean it. And, you know, the discussions around whether the renminbi will eventually become an axis of the international financial system or not, whether China wants that or not, how that would play out. Fact that Michael Froman said that the TPP was a vehicle for the United States to write the rules of the game for international trade, and all of a sudden we have Donald Trump saying that he will send or issue a note of intent to withdraw from TPP on day one. Now it seems that the United States is the reluctant superpower. So that's my first question. Second question is, could you discuss the role of the Chinese diaspora in the vicinity, the geographical, territorial vicinity? You know, mentioned 20 countries, but mostly on the ASEAN countries, and in the United States. I do some work on migration, and here in Mexico we're obsessed with the fact that the Mexican diaspora should play a role in the way that Mexico and the United States conduct their diplomatic relationship. Now, is there such an underlying assumption, you know, on the side of the Chinese leadership? is there a role for the Chinese diaspora in China's foreign policy, and especially for the Chinese diaspora within the United States? Because, you know, from the point of view of migration culture, I know there is, but I'm wondering about a role on more diplomatic and superpowers arena. And a third question has to do with, you sketched, you know, the domestic unrest. I'm wondering if that domestic unrest can still be traced to local conflicts, or whether it is about regime change. You know, there's a widespread discussion now after the death of Fidel Castro on what the Cubans really want. You know, and El País, the leading daily in Spain, which has, by the way, much better coverage of Cuba than any Mexican newspaper, you know, highlighted the fact that the big answer of the Cuban people to the death of Fidel Castro was a screaming silence, very strident silence, you know, that people just stayed home, that there was no massive demonstrations for or against. Well, it's another question whether there can be demonstrations, but, you know, there was not a reaction beyond the fact of silence.
And none were organized by the party or something, right?
Exactly.
Which is odd.
Exactly. You know, it's the same that we say here in Mexico. When the PRI wins, the PRI voters never go out to party. When the opposition wins, there's massive, you know, celebrations, and I mean, it's very hard to draw a parallel between the Mexican political system and the Chinese political system. Although some would say that there are, you know, the PRI was to a certain extent a subject of study by the Chinese leadership. But I don't want to, you know, like force things too much. I'm just asking.
Gracias. Unas breves palabras en español. Agradecer primero la amable invitación que me hace mi colega Enrique Dussel y el CHIMEX para participar en este evento. Un gusto participar en la cátedra Eugenio Anguiano, creo que es una muy merecida cátedra. El embajador Anguiano no solo fue el primer embajador de México en China, sino también es un distinguido académico ya de unos años para acá, y compartir el panel con la doctora Susan Shirk, con mi colega Carlos Heredia y con el propio Enrique. So now let me switch to English. I have 5 comments, 10 minutes and 5 comments, so probably too many comments for 10 minutes, but let me start now. You said at the beginning of your presentation, you talk about the insecurity of the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese leaders. But I said to myself that to extent, most of political regimes or most countries are also insecure. Probably the vote for Donald Trump now in the United States shows some insecurity. The agenda of Donald Trump shows also some insecurity, and probably now France feels insecure, the Great Britain feels insecure, Germany feels insecure, Mexico, of course, feels very insecure now. So what would be the peculiarity of this Chinese insecurity? What makes it different from other insecurities in the world? The second one, you know, I feel, I do agree with you in terms of the idea that peaceful rise was very effective until 2008. It was very, I mean, I think China managed to build a soft power, a good reputation. But I wonder if there was one, like a very, like a deliberate policy to build this. Whenever I go to an international conference, there's some people in the audience who raise their hand and say, well, you know, China is a peaceful power. They don't have like territorial designs. China has always been Confucian, doesn't have bad intentions. So, was there a policy of China to build this image? And if there was one policy, how did it work? Because I think it has been very effective, and it's very interesting how many people in the world think that China is completely like a dove. My third comment. I think that you chose a very interesting case to show how this domestic politics in China is affecting foreign policy, which is the South China Sea conflict. It's very interesting to see that when China had the negotiations for ASEAN +1 agreement in 2003, China was very careful in this agreement to have like favorable conditions for us in the early harvest agreement. But now it's kind of a paradox that Vietnam is like so fearful of China that it has been one of the main promoters of the TPP, right? So it's kind of interesting paradox, historical paradox, that now Vietnam is seeking actively to become an ally of the United States. So I would like to have your comments on that. My fourth point. I found very compelling your argument following Jack Snyder's book on domestic politics and the bureaucratic process of making decisions. I think there is like a good point on that. But I would also like you to discuss to what extent this renewed Chinese nationalism is a consequence of China's rise itself. You know, at some point, I think it is impossible to disguise either wealth or power. So it's very difficult to be a superpower and have such a low profile. So is this also like a historical development which comes from the nature of the international system? And this takes me to my last point. You know, some scholars, many of them in the US, many of them in China, argue that there is a strong independence between China and the United States in terms of economic exchanges, interdependence, and in terms of trade, investment. But I think it was the same argument that was made prior to the First World War. Some analysts used to say there won't be conflict between Germany and the United Kingdom because there is this economic interdependence. So is it likely to have an increasing conflict, maybe not a war, but increasing military conflict between the United States and China because the nature of international system of the transition of hegemony? And my last question, you talk about the consequences of Donald Trump election for China. I was very interested in the speech of President Xi Jinping in the last APEC summit, when he said, well, China is open. It's an open economy, we're ready for investment, we're ready for trade. So China became like sort of free trade champion, right? But it seems to me that the world is in the brink of a new cycle of beggar the neighbor policies, or a characteristic of the world economy in the late 1920s, the early 1930s. But my question is China really ready to become the leader of the world economy, of an open world economy? You mentioned some domestic problems at the end of your presentation. So, is China, maybe China is willing to take the role, to play the role, but is it really ready to play it? So, those would be my comments, and I thank you very much for your very, very interesting presentation.
Well, you know, I could talk for another hour now, but I don't want to do that because these are such good questions. So why don't I just really try to be succinct, which is not easy for a professor, but I'll try. Reluctant superpower. I mean, I agree that to a certain extent, China has joined a lot of international institutions, but was reluctant to step into a leadership position. But I think a lot of that was restraint, feeling ready. They don't actually have a whole nother agenda they don't want to tear up those organizations, entirely create a whole parallel structure. One exception is in internet governance, where they do have an alternative approach. So that is another side of China, a kind of reluctant superpower, but I'm not sure that's true today. And look at what Xi Jinping is stepping up. And, you know, I think it would be really wonderful if China took a leadership role in preserving the free, open, global economic system. And in fact, I talked with some Chinese friends about why doesn't China try to resuscitate the Doha round? Let China do that. Even if you don't succeed, think what a great reputation builder that would be. So anyway, you know, I hope China does that. The problem is that their own economy has become more closed, not more open. And their treatment of foreign firms has gotten more problematic. And there are still many sectors closed off to foreign investment. So, you know, the United States has been negotiating a bilateral investment treaty in the hopes that that could become the basis for negotiating away a lot of these non-tariff barriers that have emerged on the basis of reciprocity, standard of reciprocity. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The Chinese diaspora, I really respected the way, and still, the Chinese government does not try to turn the Chinese diaspora into what's the word for this? You know, kind of a front or you know, be part of Chinese foreign policy. They're very cautious about this, especially in Southeast Asia. So that's where there are very large numbers of Chinese, and they always said, you're a citizen of the country where you live, you're not a Chinese citizen, we're not going to try to give you the line that you're supposed to promote. That may be breaking down a little bit in countries like Australia, where they're engaged in very active external You can call it public diplomacy, or you can call it propaganda. When we do it, it's public diplomacy. When they do it, it's propaganda. There are a lot of people wringing their hands about this now. But, I think the Chinese diaspora has been very important for China's economic takeoff, early investment and this kind of thing. But they are quite nationalist, too. If you ask Chinese Mexicans or Chinese Americans about the South China Sea, you probably get, a lot of people who think that belongs to us, we've got the historical claim, whatever. So, but it hasn't, the government hasn't really used it because I think they recognize that would cause a tremendous backlash from the governments. I just want to point out, I was just reading this morning how Chinese Americans voted 83% Democratic. Yeah, 17% voted for Donald Trump. 17%. So typically Asian Americans, that's not just Chinese Americans, but Asian Americans vote Democratic in the U.S. Domestic unrest, most of it is local conflicts. I can't remember who asked me that. It is, there's no evidence of any movement for a regime change in China. But the leaders worry about it nonetheless, because in the Soviet Union they didn't have it either, but the regime fell. And also they've seen in these color revolutions how you can have no revolutionary movement per se, but you can have a revolution very suddenly. Regime can collapse. Just some spark, something that really becomes a focal point of people's anger. And these regimes, of course, Communist Party regimes are harder to bring down, but still, it could happen. So they worry about it. Insecurity, I think you're talking about the insecurity of the public. I'm talking about the insecurity of the leaders. So that's a little different. Was there or is there an effort to a self-conscious strategy of presenting an image of being a peaceful rising power? Absolutely, yes. Why is Vietnam turned away from China to a certain extent, although still needing to manage relations with China? They haven't become outright hostile to China. They still have a lot of economic relations with China. Historically, Vietnam is highly suspicious of China. It's actually a big domestic political issue in Vietnam. Vietnam has had anti-Chinese protests, a lot of them. And the leaders are kind of split between those who are more pro-Chinese and those who are more anti-Chinese. So the Vietnamese leaders have their own worries about their own survival in power, and the China issue gets intertwined with that. So that's not anti-Chinese position is very popular in Vietnam with the public. And then, of course, the whole South China Sea thing made them quite fearful in the way I described. I agree it's hard to be a superpower with a low international profile. International relations realists would say that when you have a rising power, it gets more powerful, they're going to grab as much as they can. I'm not a realist. I think international relations outcomes are a lot more contingent and that domestic politics matters. So, you know, I think if you're right, then the odds of China rising peacefully are very low. And I guess I'm too much of an optimist and care too much about China. In U.S.-China interdependence and peace, you know, obviously Chinese and Americans alike are well aware of the World War I precedent for war between countries that were quite interdependent, although that interdependence was mostly trade and not investment. So I don't know if that matters. And I think that's it.
Well, thank you very much. So we have a good time for questions, suggestions. We will make at least one, if not two, rounds of questions. Now, if you can please give your name and please be very clear, put your microphone close to you so we all understand.
Hello, my name is Eduardo. I'm also a Chinese studies scholar. I thank you for your very interesting presentation, and I would like to know your insights about that Taiwan has in this nationalist anti-foreign sentiment that you was referring to, because I think China has this dilemma between reintegrate Taiwan and to become a full nation state, but to continue the status quo in the region because it serves for the sentiment, anti-foreign nationalist sentiment. So I don't know if Taiwan would be in the future breaking point to these tendencies or these trends in Chinese foreign policy. I don't know. I would like to know your opinion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Someone else?
Hi again. Last one time I asked you something, I forget introduce myself. My name is Oscar.
I don't think we can hear, the microphone's not working.
Okay, you hear me now? Good, thank you. Well, my first question is for Carlos Heredia. Well, it is not a question. He made a risky comparison between Heredia and Communist Party, but well, it's just a comment. Dr. Osher, you mentioned something very interesting about the Chinese values. What is the main difference between Chinese values and Western values? I believe globalization has shaped a lot of cultures and countries. Your point of view, what's the main difference between Chinese values and Western values? Thank you.
Just a small point, if you allow me, about Russia, China, and United States in the new era that it's about to open now. I suppose that one of the persons that are looking very, very careful what happened with the American-Chinese relations now is Mr. Putin. I believe that if he thinks that China is being pushed too much by some Trump policies on trade, on exchange rate policies, in general, on human rights, they will be very, very happy to try to extend a helping hand in terms of not giving China the impression that could feel a little bit isolated in this new situation. And I am convinced that despite the problems in the past, there is a nearly natural, I would say, affinity or a situation that favors a closer relationship between China and Russia. And being that the case, probably one of the questions that need to be very much in mind of those deciding the approach to China in the immediate future will be how, if they really want to push China again closer to Russia, or if we will try to avoid that kind of result. I wonder what will be your view on this question. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we'll make a second round.
Taiwan. Taiwan is a big challenge to Beijing. And it's super interesting to me that during the Hu Jintao era, when we see the growth of the emergence of a more assertive Chinese foreign policy, Hu Jintao, the one thing he protected was Taiwan policy. And of course, Ma Ying-jeou being president meant that he had a partner in that effort, but basically there was will there on the part of the Beijing leadership to take a flexible approach to Taiwan, right? To endorse this so-called 92 consensus. I don't want to get into the theology of cross-strait policy, but it's a position that Taiwan had taken, that Beijing previously had rejected, and then they decided actually that was the best they could get and they would embrace it. And now they're trying to press the new president of Taiwan to embrace it. I just view these the way I think about the theological principles is that these are magic words. Beijing's always trying to get Taiwan's leaders to utter the magic words that indicate that somehow they could say, declare victory that Taiwan is part of China. But if the will is there, then they'll live with different magic words. But the challenge that China's leaders now face with Taiwan is, for 8 years or more, they took this very flexible approach to Taiwan, allowing a lot more economic integration, not making any threats to the Taiwan leadership, having people go back and forth, tourism, students, and even despite this benevolent attitude, on the Taiwan side, they still got the growth of Taiwan nationalism and something called the Sunflower Movement of students who objected to Taiwan becoming increasingly economically integrated with the mainland. So, you know, from the standpoint of China's leaders, they say, well, gee, when we're tough and rigid, we get Taiwan nationalism. When we're flexible, we get Taiwan nationalism. So what should we do? And meanwhile, their own public, I don't think, my own view is that Chinese leaders are not that constrained by nationalist public opinion on the mainland as to how to handle Taiwan policy. For one thing, they've never allowed a demonstration focused on Taiwan. They just suppress the demonstration. They allow demonstrations on Japan, but not Taiwan. I think they're afraid that it could get out of control and turn against them or something. But I don't believe people in China worry that much about Taiwan. I don't think it's in the forefront of their mind. So if it's quiet and the status quo gets maintained and the Taiwan leadership doesn't pursue legal independence in any high-profile way, any provocative way, I think it's fine. I think, and I think Xi Jinping right now is in a wait-and-see mode, although what just happened this week suggests that may be changing because Hong Kong took possession of a bunch of armored personnel carriers that were being shipped from Taiwan to Singapore because the Singaporeans still train in Taiwan. Singaporean military still trains in Taiwan. And China's known about this. It's been going on for 40 years. But they now decided that they're too offended by this military cooperation between Singapore and Taiwan. And so they got the Hong Kong authorities to confiscate these armored personnel carriers, which will really alarm people in Taiwan, and it'll really alarm people in Singapore. Could turn Singapore more hostile to China in a way it hasn't been before. So that may change. I'm sorry I went on too long about that, but it's a very important issue in Chinese role in the world. Chinese and Western powers, how do they behave differently? Well, I think, you know, if you have popular elections, that's a big constraint about provocative foreign policy behavior because you don't want to go to war. People don't like war. The voters don't like war. You don't have voters. I mean, that is a major constraint and a factor in the so-called democratic peace. Another factor in the democratic peace that some colleagues of mine did some research on is that democratic countries have more allies than authoritarian countries. And that predicts that you have greater ability to achieve your goals through other methods other than war. And they make an argument, I think, is very interesting, that authoritarian countries tend to be out for their own interests. And the reason they don't have allies and friends is they're not producing public goods that are shared with these other countries. But democratic countries tend to have more allies because they're less selfish in their behavior and more interested in public goods. So those are a few theories. Finally, Russia. I'm glad you brought that up. It's really hard to know how this is going to play out because Donald Trump has had this kind of bromance, we call it, America, with Putin. And yet, under Putin, the Russian government interfered in the American election. There are going to be hearings about that in Congress. So, you know, Republicans as well as Democrats strongly object to that. So, we don't really know how Trump will, whether or not he'll be able to carry out an effort to improve relations with Russia. He's very focused on ISIS, so he'll try to cooperate better with Russia in Syria to support the Assad regime, which you saw what happened. Trump got elected, the Russians undertook the most brutal, or Assad undertook with Russian support, the most brutal genocidal violence in Syria. Horrible. And those events are connected, there's no doubt about that. But what are we going to do about it? You know, the Chinese, of course, are not as much of a factor in fighting ISIS, which is going to be a major foreign policy objective of the Trump administration. So, you know, Xi Jinping may think that he can become good friends with Xi Jinping the way he wants to be good friends with Putin. They can all play golf together or something. But it could also work the other way, in which he gets closer to Russia and China is the enemy number one. Now, how would Putin handle that? I don't know. We may be back to this triangular kind of relationship in which one of them tries to get leverage on the others by tilting one way or the other. And we may see that again as we did back in the 1970s. But I agree that U.S. should avoid policies that drive China and Russia together. I think that would be, and I don't see, on the one hand, there's some affinity in that these are kind of authoritarian leaders are not particularly friendly to the United States, West. But on the other hand, China and Russia are highly suspicious of one another too. I like to say that this relationship is self-limiting. They have this long border. They have a lot of historical animosities toward one another. And I think that their relationship is very instrumental, transactional, and it's really, I mean, certainly it's not something we should try to reinforce, but I think there are limits to how close they will get to one another.
Thank you very much. So we'll make a second short round of questions. Please, we start here, there.
Muchas gracias, doctora. Thank you so much for everything you've revealed and shared with us. In Mexico, we are worried about China, but we're not worried about China from an ideological point of view. There was a time in which China was at fault because of ideological battles, and China was the promoter of unrest. Nowadays, we don't think of China as a danger, a political danger to Mexican interests. What we see about China is that Chinese goods are coming in by floods into the Mexican market. And number two, we have the impression that China will become a superpower, as this word has been used today, but not so much as an ideological superpower, but as an economic superpower. And therefore, when we look at TPP, we understand that TPP is the US answer to the Chinese economic superpower, more than an answer to the Chinese ideology. That brings me to the second thing. What do we have to think about China? Where is China going? The investments of China in Latin America are huge, and they are coming to be larger and larger, and we understand that China wants raw materials and besides markets. And we feel that we expect China to be more and more important in Latin America because of the economic power, but not so much of ideology. That brings us to the third question. Where is China really going? Is China the old-fashioned ideological power who is still trying to impose in different countries its particular formula of society? It does not appear so, because it seems that China has gone more into the economic power aspect. The last thing we would say, let us not forget entirely ideology, because ideology means culture. And maybe the last thing which will subsist on the earth is the cultural battles. That is happening when we speak of ISIS and Daesh, or when we speak of the Kashmir problem in India and Pakistan. That is cultural more than economic. So therefore the questions really subsist. Number one, is China really wanting to be the great superpower in economic matters and is not interested in the old-fashioned way in ideology? Or we cannot avoid the cultural aspect, in which case we would ask, is China has anything to say culturally to the world, or it is simply a new rival in the economic ground of the United States?
Thank you very much.
Good evening, my name is Ignacio Vargas. My question is in order of the comments of the sir. What are the opportunities of Mexico in terms of trading, in terms of economic issues with all these changes? You know, Trump, China, that is, it seems like an open economy. We don't know. What are the opportunities that we have? What we have to take advantage of this? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ulysses. Nice to meet you. I want to go further with all the explanation you gave and the questions from everybody here. Everybody's seeing trading, commerce. I really want to go with national security in Mexico and of course in the United States. The main point is actually Mexico has a strong and unfortunate influence from some sectors in Israel, already in Mexico, in the government, in the businesses, in several areas. I read some documents about the war against drugs in Mexico has also something to do with Mossad and all other groups involved. Understanding or trying to understand Chinese culture, Chinese ideology, and even though that probably the Russians, they have differences with China, etc., they have been living together for more centuries than the history of the United States and Mexico together. So they know each other by far. So what could be the point where China, feeling afraid or with certain kind of situation, security, or this way to expand their market, now with Donald Trump, could push a button, not direct to China, maybe through another one, to show their power, their actual power. And why I started saying I want to go further on this, or even more in the future, there was a ship from North Korea in the coast of Mexico for a certain time. I don't know if years, or probably months. As far as I read, it was years. And this ship is already taken by the Mexican government, and they are doing something with this. Of course, the leader of North Korea is not happy about it. And now with Fidel Castro on the other side, that he passed away, and he tried always to have a nice relationship with Mexico. So what could be the scenario where these countries, these nations, may have certain impact or certain attack, direct attack to Mexico? And how the United States, with Donald Trump saying, well, we put a wall, oh, you have a problem? So it's your problem, not my problem. So how could be this futuristic scenario, maybe not realistic, into all the Chinese ideology to move on? Thank you.
One last one.
Hi, Abraham. I would like to know your opinion with the people that you have been talking with, like scholars and people in politics. Where do you see like the biggest challenge in the China peaceful rise? If it's in the domestic area, or if it's in the foreign policy area? And I think it's like two levels. If it's domestically, you have like a rise in, even though Chinese media is controlled by the government, but you have much more and more participation of the people in social media. You have much more awareness. Can you hear me well? Much more awareness of what happens inside of China, right? Even you have now more Chinese people feeling this empowerment because now they're taking positions that before they were only taken by foreigners. So this new culture of individualism in China is rising, and that might also face a threat to the control that before was top down from the government to the people, but now maybe the people is playing a major role. That is in the domestic side, and then in the foreign side, in the other countries arena. Is it really that, when you were talking about other Asian countries, is it really a major threat to China when these countries are not equiparable or commensurable in size, economically, or in militarily? And the United States, when we see Trump, he was talking about build a wall versus Mexicans, but he was not talking about not maybe China. You know, his threats or his attacks to China were not the major axis of his campaign. It was with Mexico, which is something kind of easy to win, but not with China, which is maybe the thing that main affected the American economy, right? So, yeah.
Very briefly, I don't see that China is an ideological threat. China is ambitious, definitely, especially under Xi Jinping, and wants to be a global power as well as a regional power. I don't think it's limited entirely to being an economic power. I think the status and of being a sort of more comprehensive global power is important to China. That means look at China's leadership of a lot of international organizations now is very important. There's a new Chinese leader of Interpol, UNIDO. Someone was telling me here the head of UNIDO is Chinese. We had, of course, a chief economist at the World Bank being Chinese. You know, so, but I think that's great, that's fine. So I don't think China has an ideology to spread. I don't think there really is a China model that is very attractive to, I mean, of course it's been a success, but what explains the success? Is it authoritarian rule? No. Certainly if I'm an authoritarian politician in Africa or Latin America, I like that. And there is this ease that China has of dealing with those kinds of political leaders. But I don't think they're really trying to spread a certain ideology or type of politics. But I don't think that their presence on these other continents will be limited to commercial activities, because I think they will build bases. You will see Chinese military starting to go all over the world. They're already off the Horn of Africa. They are putting a base in Africa. So, you know, I think that's likely to happen, and I don't think there's any reason to be alarmed about it. It's kind of a natural development, and so long as China allows open access to other countries to its projects and things, you know, so that it doesn't try to monopolize the benefits exclusively, and other countries welcome the investment, no, I think that's fine. And the United States should not see this as a threat to the United States. What are the opportunities for Mexico? I'm afraid that's beyond my vision. I mean, I'm aware of the fact that Mexico has confronted direct competition from China, from Vietnam, in manufacturing and in third markets, as well as Chinese products coming here into consumer markets. So, you know, that's globalization. It's hard to see what is the answer for Mexico. Obviously, promoting exports, if it can, greater integration with Latin America, other Latin American countries, continued economic integration with the United States, and again, there's a big question mark about whether or not Trump is going to try to kill that. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that. And the other questions about the threats to China from domestic bottom-up threats to China's leaders versus the threat of Trump, I don't know which is. I think Chinese leaders always worry mostly about domestic threats, and international threats are secondary.
Okay, thank you very much. I wish to thank very much Susan and of course Carlos and Jose Luis, and I invite you to come next. Thank you very much.